They called it the joy plant, and then built an empire making sure the joy was mandatory. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most profitable flower in human history. A plant so powerful it toppled empires, started wars, and quietly slipped into the food and medicine of millions of soldiers who never knew they were being drugged. Here's the thing that should make you stop and think. Opium didn't rise to global dominance because it was smuggled in dark alleyways by criminals. It rose because the most powerful government on earth decided addiction was good for business. The British Empire didn't stumble into the drug trade. It built the drug trade with lawyers, accountants, warships, and a level of corporate cynicism that would make a modern pharmaceutical executive weep with admiration. They turned an ancient flower into the engine of an empire, and when people tried to say no, Britain sent the navy. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. Roughly 5,000 years ago, in the fertile river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, someone figured out that if you scored the unripe seed pod of a specific poppy plant with a small blade, a milky white liquid oozed out. Left overnight, that liquid hardened into a dark, bitter gum, and when you burned it and inhaled the smoke, the pain went away. All of it. Every ache, every wound, every grief, gone. The Sumerians called it Hulgil, the joy plant, not metaphorically, literally. They were describing the pharmacological experience with the directness of people who had no reason to be embarrassed about it. Pain relief was miraculous, euphoria was divine, and the plant that gave you both was understandably considered a gift from the gods. This wasn't fringe knowledge. Opium appeared in Sumerian medical texts, in Egyptian papyrus scrolls, and in the religious rituals of civilizations that had never met each other, but had all, independently, discovered the same flower. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BC, describes opium preparations for children who cry too much. Egyptian physicians were essentially prescribing sedatives to toddlers 4,000 years ago. The ambition of modern pharmaceutical marketing is, in many ways, not new at all. The ancient Egyptians didn't just use opium medicinally. They grew it, traded it, and built dedicated poppy fields in the Nile Delta near a city called Thebes, which is why the primary species of opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, was sometimes called the Theban poppy. The Egyptians traded opium with the Phoenicians and the Minoans, who carried it across the Mediterranean in distinctive ceramic vessels shaped specifically for transport. Small juglets with a form that archaeologists now recognize instantly as an early drug delivery container. By around 1300 BC, the poppy had reached Cyprus, Crete, and mainland Greece. The Greeks embedded opium into their mythology with a logic that feels almost too on the nose. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, the god of dreams, were both depicted holding poppy stems. The connection between the plant and the altered state it created wasn't hidden or shameful in ancient culture. It was divine. It was the gift that let humans briefly touch something beyond the ordinary limits of consciousness, and then wake up the next morning to plant another field. Homer's Odyssey, written around the 8th century BC, contains a reference to a substance called nepenthe, described as something added to wine that erases all grief and pain. Scholars have argued for centuries about what nepenthe actually was. The most compelling answer, supported by context and chemistry, is opium dissolved in wine. Which means that Western literature's foundational epic contains what is functionally a recipe for laudanum. Recorded 3,000 years before the British invented it, the Greeks also understood to some degree that the joy plant had a dark side. Hippocrates, the father of medicine whose oath every doctor still swears, recommended opium cautiously, noting its power to ease suffering but acknowledging that too much of it was dangerous. Greek physicians prescribed it for pain, insomnia, and diarrhea. They also noted that stopping it abruptly caused suffering. They didn't have a word for withdrawal, but they recognized the phenomenon. Then came Alexander the Great, and opium went global. When Alexander's armies swept through Persia and India between 334 and 323 BC, they carried Greek culture, Greek philosophy, and Greek trade goods, including opium. The Persians, who had already encountered it from the east, adopted it enthusiastically into their medical tradition. From Persia, the knowledge of the opium poppy travelled further east, into India, where it found conditions, climate, culture, and agricultural sophistication that would make it a dominant crop for the next 2,000 years. India's relationship with opium was complex from the start. The Mughal emperors used it recreationally and medically. Akbar, one of the greatest Mughal rulers, reportedly used opium regularly. So did many of his courtiers. The drug was mixed into a paste with water or wine, eaten, smoked, and administered medicinally across the subcontinent in formulations that varied by region and tradition. Indian physicians were writing about opium's effects, dosing, and dangers, while Europe was still figuring out that bloodletting maybe wasn't the answer to everything. But India's importance to the opium story wasn't just cultural, it was geographical. The Ganges plain, flat, fertile, and reliably watered, turned out to be among the best agricultural land in the world for growing Papaver somniferum. The poppy thrived there in a way it thrived almost nowhere else on Earth, producing yields of raw opium that were consistent, high quality, and scalable. This fact, completely unrelated to politics or empire, was going to determine the shape of global history for the next 3 centuries. Meanwhile, in the Arab world, opium's reputation was shifting. Arab physicians, particularly Avicenna, writing in the 11th century, refined the Greek medical knowledge and added their own observations. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which became the standard medical reference across both the Islamic world and medieval Europe, dedicated substantial attention to opium. He described its therapeutic uses in precise detail. He also described overdose deaths. He knew exactly what it could do in both directions. Arab traders carried opium along the Silk Road and the sea routes of the Indian Ocean. By 1000 AD, opium had reached China, not through Britain, not through European colonialism, but through trade, introduced gradually into a civilization of roughly 50 million people who had no prior experience with the substance and no cultural framework for managing it. China's first encounter with opium was relatively benign. It was used medicinally, primarily for diarrhea and pain. The amounts were small, the use was limited, and for several centuries it caused no particular social problem. This is important context, because what happened later wasn't the natural result of a weak culture encountering a powerful drug. It was the result of a deliberate, structured, profit-driven campaign to create mass addiction on an industrial scale. Europe rediscovered opium in the 16th century when Portuguese traders encountered it along their new sea routes to Asia. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to trade opium in China, exchanging it for silk and porcelain. They did so on a modest scale, constrained by their limited production capacity and small merchant fleet. The damage was real but contained. Then the Dutch arrived, then the British, and the modest ancient trade in a pain-relieving flower became something the Sumerians who first called it Hul-Gil, the joy plant, could never have imagined. The joy plant was about to become a weapon. The East India Company was founded in 1600 with a royal charter and a simple mandate: make money trading with Asia. It started with pepper, cotton, and indigo. Within a century, it had evolved into something that had never existed before in human history. a private corporation with its own army, its own courts, its own currency, and its own foreign policy. By the mid-17th century, it controlled more territory than most European nations, and its most profitable product wasn't silk, wasn't tea, wasn't spices, it was addiction. The company's entry into the opium business wasn't accidental or gradual. It was a deliberate strategic decision made by men in London boardrooms who understood exactly what they were doing. When the company gained control of Bengal in 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, which was less a battle and more a bribed coup, they inherited something more valuable than gold mines or tax revenues. They inherited the Ganges Plain, the richest opium-growing land on earth, already populated by generations of skilled poppy farmers who knew exactly how to cultivate, harvest, and process the crop. The company moved fast. Within years of conquering Bengal, they had established a complete monopoly over opium production. Farmers, called ryots, were contractually bound to grow poppy and sell their entire harvest exclusively to the company at prices the company set. Not market prices, company prices. The difference between what farmers received and what the opium sold for on the international market was enormous, and that gap flowed directly into company profits. It was structurally indistinguishable from a protection racket, except it was entirely legal, backed by the British state, and run with the administrative efficiency of a modern multinational. The processing operation was equally sophisticated. Raw opium, the dried latex scraped from poppy seed pods, arrived at company collection centres in Bengal, where it was weighed, graded, and sent to massive processing facilities at Patna and Benares. There, workers shaped it into uniform balls roughly the size of cannonballs, each weighing about 3.5 pounds, wrapped in dried poppy leaves and packed into wooden chests. Each chest held 40 balls. Every ball was stamped, recorded, and tracked. The paperwork was meticulous. The quantities were staggering. By the 1770s, the company was shipping hundreds of chests annually. By the 1820s, that number had grown to tens of thousands. The operation had its own internal quality control. Company inspectors graded opium on a scale that assessed colour, consistency, and moisture content, rejecting substandard batches with the same rigour a modern food manufacturer might apply to a production line. The absurdity of this precision, the careful quality standards applied to a product being manufactured specifically to addict human beings, was apparently invisible to everyone involved. The legal structure the company used to distribute this product was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. The company itself didn't technically sell opium to China. That would have been awkward, given that China had formally banned opium imports. Instead, the company auctioned its processed opium in Calcutta to licensed private merchants, called country traders, who then transported it to China on their own ships and sold it there. When the Chinese authorities complained, the company could honestly say it wasn't directly involved in the China trade. The country traders took the legal and physical risk. The company took the profit. This arrangement was so clever, so deliberately constructed to provide plausible deniability, that it deserves a moment of genuine admiration for its cynicism. The company had created the world's first corporate drug trafficking operation, with built-in legal insulation, outsourced distribution, and government backing, roughly 200 years before the concept of money laundering existed as a legal category. The financial scale of this operation was not a minor footnote to the company's activities. Opium revenue funded the company's wars in India. It paid for the armies that conquered more territory, which grew more opium, which funded more armies. By the early 19th century, opium represented between 15 and 20% of the company's total revenue in India. Some years, in certain administrative periods, the figure was higher. Remove opium from the East India Company's balance sheet, and the whole enterprise becomes economically questionable. The British Empire's expansion across India was, in a very direct financial sense, underwritten by Chinese addiction. The human machinery that made this possible was equally vast. Hundreds of thousands of Bengali farmers grew the poppy under contracts that gave them no meaningful choice. Tens of thousands of labourers worked in the processing factories, rolling opium balls by hand, breathing the fumes in poorly ventilated rooms for hours each day. Many of them became addicted simply through occupational exposure. Company records acknowledge this. Nobody in London lost sleep over it. The shipping network that moved finished opium from Bengal to China was, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily sophisticated. The country traders used fast, purpose-built vessels designed to outrun pirate interception and Chinese naval patrols. The route went from Calcutta to the South China Sea, offloading at floating warehouses, called receiving ships, anchored just outside Chinese territorial waters. Chinese smugglers, running small, fast boats, would collect the opium at night and distribute it through an inland network that reached cities and provinces far from the coast. This inland distribution network was organised, hierarchical, and deeply corrupt. Chinese customs officials, local magistrates, and port authorities all took their cut. The smuggling operation worked because it was, functionally, not smuggling at all. It was a shadow import system that everyone with power either knew about or directly participated in. The Qing dynasty's official prohibition on opium existed simultaneously with a practical reality in which thousands of officials were personally profiting from its distribution. But the company wasn't just selling to a pre-existing market, it was creating one. The systematic expansion of the Chinese opium market was not a passive process driven by consumer demand. Company agents and country traders actively worked to open new distribution channels, penetrate inland provinces, and lower entry prices to hook first-time users. The economics of addiction made this rational. Every new user was a recurring revenue source. Getting someone addicted was a marketing investment that paid indefinite returns, because the product eliminated its own competition by making the customer physiologically unable to choose otherwise. The scale of what followed was catastrophic. In the early 1700s, China consumed a few hundred chests of opium annually, a marginal trade. By 1800, the number had risen to roughly 4,000 chests per year. By 1838, it had reached 40,000 chests, a tenfold increase in under 4 decades. Estimates of the number of addicted Chinese during this period range from 2 million to 12 million, depending on the source and methodology. Even the conservative figure represents a public health disaster of a magnitude that had never been seen anywhere in history. The economic consequences for China were as severe as the human ones. China had historically run a trade surplus with the West, accumulating vast quantities of silver. The opium trade reversed this entirely. Silver now flowed out of China in enormous quantities, paying for opium, enriching British merchants, funding the East India Company's operations across the subcontinent. The Chinese economy was being hollowed out in real time, its monetary reserves draining away to finance the addiction of its own population. In London, the men responsible for this understood the numbers perfectly. They read the same reports, they received the same data, and the response from the company's leadership and from the British government that increasingly backed and supervised it was not alarm or remorse. It was interest in maintaining volumes. When individual voices, including some within the company itself and some in the British Parliament, raised moral objections, they were answered with arguments about free trade, about the rights of commerce, and about the personal responsibility of Chinese consumers who chose to smoke opium. The personal responsibility argument deployed in the 1820s and 1830s to defend a system that was deliberately manufacturing addiction in a foreign population, would reappear almost word for word 2 centuries later in the American opioid crisis. Some rhetorical playbooks are apparently timeless. The company's monopoly wasn't just a commercial structure. It was a strategic instrument of imperial control. A Bengal that grew opium was a Bengal too economically entangled in company revenue streams to easily resist company governance. Farmers bound by poppy contracts couldn't easily transition to food crops or develop independent economic power. The opium system didn't just fund the empire, it helped hold the empire together by creating forms of economic dependency that constrained the options of the colonized. By the 1830s, the East India Company had effectively become the most powerful drug trafficking organization in human history, operating openly, legally, with government sanction, and at a scale that dwarfed anything that came before or, arguably, anything that came after. Its product was chemically addictive. Its market was created by design. Its victims had no recourse. And when the Chinese government finally decided it had endured enough, the company's response would set a precedent for how empires handle inconvenient moral objections. They sent the gunboats. In 1839, a Chinese imperial official named Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with a mandate that no one in the history of the opium trade had ever actually enforced. Stop it. Completely. Not reduce it, not tax it, not quietly ignore it in exchange for bribes. Stop it entirely and permanently. Lin Zexu was not a radical or a hothead. He was a careful, methodical administrator who had spent years documenting the devastation opium had caused across Chinese society. The hollowed-out families, the soldiers too addicted to fight, the government clerks too sedated to govern, the silver hemorrhaging out of the economy like blood from an open wound. What he found in Canton was worse than the report suggested. The Pearl River Delta had become the central artery of the opium trade, a floating marketplace of corruption, addiction, and barely concealed contempt for Chinese law. Foreign merchants operated from ships permanently anchored in the harbour, conducting business with a confidence that reflected exactly how seriously they took Chinese sovereignty, which was not at all. The receiving ships, those floating warehouses loaded with Bengal opium, sat within sight of Chinese shore batteries that had never once fired at them. Everyone understood the arrangement. The guns were decorative. Lin Zexu moved against the system with a precision that shocked everyone who had assumed Chinese resistance would remain, as it always had, theatrical. He demanded that all foreign merchants surrender their opium stockpiles. Not some of it. All of it. He sealed off the foreign trading quarter, cut off food supplies, and made clear that no one was leaving until the opium was handed over. The British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, was caught completely off guard. He had operated for years in an environment where Chinese prohibitions were background noise, not actual policy. Over the following weeks, merchants surrendered more than 1,200 tons of opium. It arrived in a continuous procession of chests, crates, and barrels, the physical accumulation of years of trade, an almost incomprehensible quantity of processed addiction. Lin Zexu then did something that ensured his place in history and simultaneously guaranteed a British military response. He destroyed all of it. The destruction took 23 days. Workers mixed the opium with salt, lime and water in large trenches dug near the coast, then flushed the dissolved mixture into the sea. Lin Zexu reportedly apologized to the sea for the pollution. He wrote letters to Queen Victoria, careful, reasoned letters, asking how a nation that prohibited opium for its own citizens could justify flooding another country with it. Victoria never replied. The letters were read by British officials who found them philosophically interesting and strategically irrelevant. In London, the destruction of 1,200 tons of British merchant property landed with the force of an economic grievance dressed up as a diplomatic crisis. The merchants demanded compensation. The government, led by Lord Palmerston, a man with a talent for transforming commercial interests into national honour, decided that China's actions constituted an intolerable assault on British rights. The right in question being specifically the right to sell drugs to China regardless of Chinese law. What followed was one of the most nakedly cynical military campaigns in the history of Western imperialism, which is a field with exceptionally strong competition. The First Opium War began in 1839 and lasted until 1842. It was not, by the standards of 19th century warfare, particularly long or costly for the British side. What it was, in military terms, was a complete mismatch. British warships, including the steam-powered Nemesis, a shallow draft iron vessel that could navigate Chinese rivers and was essentially unkillable by the weapons the Qing forces possessed, moved up the Chinese coast with a methodical destructiveness. Forts fell, fleets were sunk or scattered, cities were bombarded into submission. The Chinese military in 1839 was not equipped to fight the industrial British Navy of 1839. This wasn't a failure of courage. Chinese soldiers at several engagements fought with genuine determination against weapons they had no answer for. It was a failure of 2 centuries of relative isolation and institutional stagnation while Britain had been industrializing. The matchlock muskets and shore-mounted cannons that Chinese fortifications relied upon belonged to a different era entirely. British forces suffered fewer than 100 combat deaths during the entire war. Chinese casualties numbered in the thousands. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was China's introduction to what became known as the unequal treaty system, a series of agreements extracted under military duress that systematically stripped China of sovereignty over its own territory and commerce. Britain received Hong Kong outright. 5 treaty ports, Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Foochow and Ningpo, were forced open to British trade on British terms. China paid 21 million silver dollars in reparations, a sum that included, without any apparent sense of irony, compensation for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. China was charged for the drugs that had been used to addict its own population. Let that settle for a moment. Crucially, the Treaty of Nanking did not legalize opium. The drug remained officially prohibited in China. This meant the trade continued exactly as before, technically illegal, practically unstoppable, and now backed by the implicit threat of military force if anyone tried to interfere again. The British had gone to war to protect a smuggling operation and won. The legal status of opium in China was simply no longer relevant, because the power that enforced Chinese law had just been demonstrated to be inferior to the power protecting the smugglers. 14 years later, Britain decided this arrangement still wasn't satisfactory. The trigger for the Second Opium War in 1856 was a dispute over a ship called the Arrow, a vessel of murky ownership and murkier legal status that Chinese authorities boarded and searched while looking for a known pirate. The British claimed the ship was flying a British flag at the time of boarding, making the search an insult to British honour. Whether the flag was actually flying remains disputed by historians. What is not disputed is that Palmerston, now Prime Minister, used the incident as a pretext with such obvious enthusiasm that even his own Parliament was uncomfortable, and a motion censuring his China policy actually passed in the House of Commons. Palmerston called an election. He won it, and the war proceeded. France joined the Second Opium War as a co-belligerent, providing the campaign with a veneer of multilateral legitimacy and, more practically, additional firepower. The French justification was the murder of a French missionary in China, a genuine grievance, but one that had very little to do with trade in narcotics. the two powers advanced together up the coast and eventually toward Beijing itself. When Qing imperial commissioners attempted to negotiate and the talks broke down, Anglo-French forces marched on the capital. What happened in Beijing in October 1860 stands as one of the most deliberate acts of cultural destruction in modern history. The Summer Palace, Yuanming Yuan, was a complex of some 200 buildings, artificial lakes, gardens and treasure houses accumulated over a century of Qing imperial patronage. It contained irreplaceable artworks, manuscripts, furniture, and objects representing the pinnacle of Chinese imperial culture. British and French forces looted it first. Soldiers carried away everything they could move, including objects that ended up in museums and private collections across Europe where some remain today. Then the British commander, Lord Elgin, ordered it burned. The burning took 2 days. It was deliberate, calculated, and described by Elgin himself as a punishment intended to strike at the emperor personally while avoiding civilian casualties. The logic was precise. The cruelty was architectural. Decades later, the Chinese writer Victor Hugo, who was French, not Chinese, but recognized what had happened, described the destruction as the act of two thieves, one called France and one called England. The Second Opium War ended with the Convention of Peking in 1860, which achieved what the First War had not. Opium was now formally legalized in China, its import taxed and regulated under terms entirely favorable to the suppliers. The fiction of Chinese prohibition was abandoned. The trade was now official, open, and protected by treaty. Britain had fought 2 wars over a period of 20 years not just to sell drugs, but to force a sovereign nation to legally accept those drugs as a condition of peace. The Chinese market was now fully open. Tens of millions of users, no legal barriers, British supply chains intact and expanding. The East India Company's Bengali opium fields running at maximum capacity. By the 1880s, China had an estimated 40 million opium users, approximately 1 in 10 of the entire population. But here is where the story takes a turn that most history books quietly skip over. While Britain was methodically dismantling China's ability to resist the opium trade, the drug was simultaneously flowing in the other direction, back into Britain itself, into British homes, British medicine cabinets, and British military supply chains. The empire that was addicting China was quietly addicting itself. And the British government, which had just fought 2 wars to protect the right to sell opium to foreigners, was about to discover that it had spent decades building an infrastructure it no longer fully controlled, and a product it could no longer keep out of its own soldiers' bloodstreams. The First Opium War didn't just open Chinese ports, it established a template, a precise, reusable blueprint for how a modern empire could weaponize commerce, manufacture a legal justification, deploy overwhelming military force, and extract concessions that permanently restructured another nation's economy in its favour. Britain would use this template repeatedly across the next century, in places as different as Egypt, Afghanistan, and South Africa. But before those campaigns, the empire had a more immediate problem to manage. Its own soldiers were bleeding out on foreign soil, and the only thing keeping them functional was opium. Military medicine in the mid-19th century was, by modern standards, barely medicine at all. Surgeons operated without anesthesia or reliable antiseptics. Wound infections killed more soldiers than enemy action. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid moved through encampments with a lethality that battles couldn't match. In this environment, opium wasn't a luxury or a moral indulgence. It was the closest thing military medicine had to a universal treatment. It suppressed diarrhea, dulled surgical pain, quieted the delirious, and kept badly wounded men calm enough to transport. Without it, casualty rates would have been significantly higher. Military planners understood this, and they planned accordingly. The Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, was the first major conflict in which British military medical supply chains were documented in enough detail to reveal the systematic scale of opium use. Florence Nightingale, whose reforms of military nursing during the Crimean campaign are well recorded, worked in hospitals where opium preparations were administered daily to hundreds of patients simultaneously. Her own records note the frequency and volume of opium dispensing, not as an aberration, but as standard operating procedure. Opium was in the supply manifests alongside bandages and surgical instruments. It was a military essential, as unremarkable as hardtack. What the Crimean records also show, for those willing to read them carefully, is something the military hierarchy preferred not to emphasize. Soldiers who entered hospital care for wounds or illness and received opium treatment over extended periods frequently left in a condition that wasn't purely the result of their original injury. They left dependent. The distinction between treating pain and creating addiction was a line that military medicine crossed constantly, casually, and without apparent concern for the long-term consequences to the individual soldier. The institutional logic was coldly rational. A soldier who survived a wound and returned to battle was a military asset recovered. Whether that soldier subsequently struggled with opium dependency was a problem that belonged to the future, to the soldier's family, to his community, to whatever support systems existed for veterans, which in Victorian Britain were essentially non-existent. The military's responsibility ended at the point of discharge. What came after was invisible to the supply manifests. The Boer Wars, fought in South Africa between 1880 and 1902, extended this pattern into new terrain and new scale. The British Army deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers across two conflicts, operating in a climate that generated constant casualties from disease as well as combat. Opium derivatives saturated military medicine throughout both campaigns. But something else emerged from the Boer War records that hadn't been documented as clearly before. The deliberate use of opium-based compounds not just for medical treatment, but for behavioral management of troops under sustained psychological stress. Extended guerrilla warfare, which the Second Boer War became after the conventional phase ended, created psychological conditions that conventional military medicine had no established framework for treating. Soldiers suffering from what would now be recognized as acute stress reactions or early-stage post-traumatic responses were administered opium preparations that suppressed symptoms well enough to keep them in the field. The treatment didn't address the underlying condition. It masked it, suppressed it, and made the soldier functional enough to continue fighting. This is a crucial distinction, and it will reappear in more sophisticated chemical form in both world wars. The financial architecture underpinning these military campaigns also ran directly through opium. The East India Company had been dissolved in 1858, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and its functions transferred to direct Crown control. But the opium revenue structure didn't dissolve with the company. The British Indian government, now a Crown administration, inherited the entire system: the Bengal poppy fields, the processing factories, the Calcutta auction houses, the country trader networks. Opium remained the Indian government's single largest revenue source throughout the second half of the 19th century. This created a direct financial circuit that was almost too explicit to believe. Britain fought wars across Asia and Africa using armies funded in part by opium revenue. Those armies used opium medicinally to maintain combat effectiveness. The wounded soldiers returning from those campaigns brought opium dependency home with them, creating domestic demand that supported a pharmaceutical industry that lobbied against opium regulation. The entire loop was self-reinforcing, and every point in the circuit was connected to every other point. But the Opium Wars themselves generated a second-order consequence that the empire's planners had not fully anticipated. By forcing China to legalize opium imports, and then watching Chinese consumption explode to 40 million users, Britain had created a market so large that the Bengal supply chain eventually couldn't meet it alone. Chinese domestic opium production, long suppressed by Qing authorities under the prohibition, now grew openly and rapidly. Chinese-grown opium was cheaper than Indian opium and equally potent. By the 1880s, Chinese domestic production was actually undermining the Bengal trade's profitability. The British response to this was remarkable in its audacity. Rather than accepting the natural consequence of their own market creation, British merchants and the Indian government lobbied for treaties restricting Chinese domestic production. The argument, presented with a straight face in diplomatic correspondence, was that Chinese opium was of inferior quality and harmful to consumers, a claim made by the people who had fought 2 wars to force those consumers to buy their product. The Chinese, not unreasonably, declined to restrict their own farmers' incomes to protect British profit margins. Meanwhile, India itself was changing. The opium infrastructure that had made the Bengal plains so valuable to the company was becoming a political liability. Indian nationalist movements were beginning to document the human cost of opium cultivation. The farmers who grew a cash crop they couldn't eat while food prices rose, the communities hollowed out by addiction, the revenue structure that prioritized drug production over agricultural development. The opium system wasn't just hurting China, it was systematically underdeveloping the country it was supposedly governing. Across the Atlantic, the American missionary community in China was generating a parallel pressure. American missionaries had watched the opium devastation in Chinese cities for decades and had been writing home about it with considerable passion. Their reports filtered into American Protestant churches, into congressional discussions, and eventually into the diplomatic calculations of a United States that was developing its own Pacific interests and its own opinions about how Western powers should conduct themselves in Asia. The international consensus on opium was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to shift. In 1906, the British Parliament passed a resolution acknowledging that the opium trade was morally indefensible. This was not a regulatory measure. It was not a ban or a restriction. It was a resolution, a statement of collective moral discomfort with no enforcement mechanism attached. The trade continued. The Bengal opium fields kept growing. The Calcutta auctions kept running. But the political language had changed, and political language, when it shifts, tends to eventually pull policy behind it. The more consequential development was happening not in Parliament, but in chemistry laboratories across Europe, where scientists who'd been working with opium derivatives for a century were about to produce something that would make the original drug look, by comparison, almost manageable. In 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, the same company that made aspirin, introduced a new product to the market. It was synthesized from morphine, which was itself derived from opium. It was more potent than morphine, faster acting, and produced a more intense euphoric effect. Bayer marketed it as a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine, a claim that was either a catastrophic scientific error or a deliberate commercial decision, depending on how charitably one interprets the available evidence. They named it after the German word for heroic, heroish, because test subjects reported feeling powerful and invincible when they took it. They called it heroin, and they sold it in tablet form, in bottles with cheerful labels, recommended for coughs, respiratory conditions, and as a treatment for morphine addiction. The empire that had built its wealth on the original drug had just produced, through the industrial chemistry it funded, a version approximately 10 times more powerful. The machinery of addiction had upgraded itself. and the wars that were coming would use the new version with the same institutional casualness that the Crimean surgeons had used the old one. While the empire was methodically addicting China, something equally systematic was happening inside Britain itself, quieter, more domestic, dressed in the respectable language of medicine and self-care, but chemically identical in its consequences. Victorian Britain was saturated with opium, not smuggled, not illegal, not hidden, sold openly in every pharmacy, every general store, and by travelling medicine vendors who moved through working-class neighbourhoods with carts full of bottled relief. The product had different names depending on the packaging: laudanum, paregoric, Godfrey's cordial, Dover's powder, but the active ingredient was always the same. Laudanum was opium dissolved in alcohol, typically in a ratio of roughly 1 part opium to 10 parts alcohol, sometimes flavoured with cinnamon or saffron to make it more palatable. It was cheap, cheaper than gin, cheaper than beer, and it was completely legal. A working-class family in Birmingham or Manchester could walk into a pharmacy and purchase a bottle without a prescription, without a doctor's note, without any documentation whatsoever. The pharmacist would wrap it in paper and hand it over with the same commercial neutrality reserved for selling soap or candles. The uses to which Victorians put laudanum covered almost every human ailment imaginable: toothache, headache, menstrual pain, arthritis, insomnia, anxiety, grief, cough, diarrhea, and what Victorian physicians collectively labelled nervous conditions, a diagnosis broad enough to encompass essentially any emotional state that inconvenienced the patient or those around them. The medical profession didn't prescribe laudanum reluctantly or with extensive caveats. They prescribed it the way a modern GP reaches for an antibiotic, as the obvious first-line response to a large category of complaints. Women were the primary target demographic, and the marketing around this was explicit. Pharmaceutical advertisements in Victorian newspapers and magazines depicted laudanum and its derivatives as solutions specifically for female suffering. Women's complaints, hysteria, the strains of domestic life, the exhaustion of child-rearing. The message delivered in the polite language of 19th century advertising was essentially that the appropriate chemical response to the difficulties of being a Victorian woman was sedation. Millions of women received this message and acted on it. The class dynamics of Victorian opium use were revealing in ways that the society itself refused to examine. Wealthy and middle-class users who consumed laudanum daily were described in medical literature and social commentary as suffering from nervous prostration or constitutional weakness, conditions that implied delicacy, sensitivity, even a certain refinement. Working-class users consuming the same drug at the same frequency were described as degenerate, undisciplined, and morally weak. The chemical experience was identical. The social interpretation was entirely determined by the user's income and address. This class divide had direct consequences for how addiction was treated, or rather, not treated. Wealthy addicts were managed discreetly by private physicians who maintained their supply while gently attempting to reduce dosage over time. Working-class addicts were periodically targeted by moral reform campaigns that focused on the personal failings of the individual rather than the commercial infrastructure enabling the addiction. The pharmacies and medicine manufacturers who supplied both groups continued operating without restriction throughout. The literary record of Victorian laudanum use is extraordinary in its candour. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, described opium addiction from the inside with a psychological precision that modern addiction medicine still finds clinically recognisable. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a severe laudanum addict for most of his adult life. His physician prescribed it, his publisher funded his supply, and his addiction is directly connected by literary historians to both the visionary quality and the incompleteness of his major works. Wilkie Collins, who suffered from severe gout, consumed laudanum in quantities that alarmed his contemporaries and reportedly influenced the intricate, slightly paranoid plotting of his novels. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it for years under medical supervision. These were not marginal figures or social failures. They were the cultural elite of the most powerful civilization on Earth, and they were addicted to the same substance that the same civilization was using as a tool of colonial subjugation in China. The irony was not invisible to everyone. De Quincey himself noted the connection, with a self-awareness that didn't prevent him from continuing his habit for decades. But no segment of Victorian society received opium more casually, or with more catastrophic long-term consequences than its youngest members. Babies. The opium was being given to babies. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, one of the most popular infant preparations of the 19th century, sold throughout Britain and America, contained morphine sulfate at concentrations sufficient to sedate an adult, administered to infants in doses calibrated for their smaller body weight. The marketing positioned it as a teething remedy. Parents gave it to crying infants without any awareness of what it contained, because the ingredients weren't required to be listed on the label. Godfrey's cordial, another popular infant preparation, combined opium with treacle and sassafras. It was given to working-class infants in industrial cities while their parents worked, effectively a pharmaceutical babysitting service. The infant mortality statistics in areas of high Godfrey's cordial use were documentable and documented. Physicians in the Fens region of England, where the practice was particularly widespread, recorded death rates among infants that they directly attributed to opium administration. The Registrar General's reports from the 1860s and 1870s contain this data in plain language. The information existed. The political will to act on it did not, because acting on it would have required confronting the same commercial infrastructure that was simultaneously generating substantial tax revenue and providing a convenient chemical solution to the social problem of keeping working-class infants quiet, while industrial capitalism extracted maximum labour from their parents. The pharmaceutical industry that manufactured these products was not operating in a regulatory vacuum by accident. It was operating in one by design, maintained by sustained lobbying against any attempt at labelling requirements, dosage restrictions, or prescription mandates. The arguments made against regulation in Victorian Britain, that government interference in medicine was paternalistic, that consumers had the right to make their own choices, that restricting access to opium preparations would harm legitimate sufferers, were structurally identical to arguments made against opioid regulation in the United States in the 1990s. The mechanism of addiction was not understood in the 1860s with the biochemical precision available today, but its existence was not a mystery. Physicians regularly observed patients who couldn't stop taking laudanum without severe physical distress. They documented the escalating dose requirement, the way the same amount produced diminishing relief over time, driving users to consume more to achieve the same effect. They noted the characteristic withdrawal syndrome, sweating, cramps, insomnia, extreme anxiety, and a craving so overwhelming that patients described it as a physical force overriding conscious will. This symptom cluster was well documented in Victorian medical literature long before the word addiction entered common usage. What the medical establishment largely failed to do was connect these clinical observations to a systemic critique of the commercial practices enabling them. Individual physicians might recognize individual patients as dependent. The profession as a whole did not challenge the legal, commercial, and social architecture that made mass dependency inevitable. The distance between clinical observation and political action was maintained by the same economic interests that had always maintained it: the manufacturers, the distributors, and a government whose tax revenues were tied to legal opium sales in a way that created a structural disincentive for honest regulatory assessment. By the 1870s, British military surgeons returning from colonial campaigns were adding a new dimension to the domestic picture. The Crimean veterans, the soldiers returned from India, the men who had survived the Boer Wars with bodies repaired by opium-laced medical treatment, they were coming home to a society already saturated with the drug, entering a civilian medical system that had no framework for distinguishing between legitimate pain management and the management of dependency that the military had created. The veteran who needed opium because his wound still hurt, and the veteran who needed opium because his nervous system had been restructured by months of military medical treatment looked identical from the outside. The prescribing physicians often couldn't tell the difference, and under Victorian medical culture many didn't try particularly hard. The most disturbing piece of this domestic picture, the detail that connects the Laudanum nation directly to the wartime additive story at the centre of this whole history, emerged not from pharmacy records or literary memoirs, but from military supply documents that remained largely unexamined for over a century. Buried in the procurement records of several Victorian military campaigns were entries that didn't fit neatly into the category of medical treatment. Opium-based compounds were being ordered not just for hospital stores but for general ration supplies, not in quantities consistent with anticipated casualty treatment, in quantities consistent with something else entirely, something that military planners, writing in the careful administrative language of the era, described only as morale maintenance and operational steadiness. The Empire wasn't just treating its wounded soldiers with opium, it was, in specific campaigns and specific theatres, feeding it to the healthy ones. Morphine was first isolated from opium in 1804 by a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner, who tested it on himself and 3 teenage boys, noted that it caused profound sedation and pain relief, and named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. He didn't note that it was 10 times more potent than raw opium, that it created dependency faster and more completely than any substance previously known, or that the combination of his discovery with the hypodermic needle, invented 50 years later, would produce the first modern addiction epidemic. To be fair to Serturner, he couldn't have known. The needle didn't exist yet. The hypodermic syringe, developed in the 1850s, changed the pharmacology of opium permanently. Eating or smoking opium delivered the drug slowly, through the digestive system or the lungs, with a gradual onset that the body could partially moderate. Injecting morphine directly into the bloodstream bypassed every biological buffer. The drug reached the brain in seconds, producing an intensity of effect that oral or smoked opium simply couldn't match. It also created dependency with a speed and severity that left physicians, military surgeons, and eventually governments scrambling to understand what they had unleashed. The American Civil War was the first major conflict in which morphine injections were used systematically as battlefield medicine. Union and Confederate surgeons both used it extensively, for amputations performed without adequate anesthesia, for wound pain, for the management of the dysentery and typhoid that killed more soldiers than bullets. Estimates suggest that between 400,000 and 500,000 Union soldiers alone received morphine treatment during the war. When the war ended, a significant percentage of them returned home with what physicians at the time called soldier's disease, a term that described morphine dependency with a clinical neutrality that avoided any implication of moral failing on the part of the veteran. Britain watched the American experience carefully. The military medical establishment drew conclusions, wrote reports, and then largely continued doing the same thing, because the alternative, managing battlefield casualties without morphine, was not a serious option anyone was prepared to consider. The drug's military utility was simply too great. The dependency problem was real but survivable. Casualties without morphine treatment were a more immediate operational concern than veterans with dependency problems after discharge. The mathematics of war consistently produce this calculation, and military planners consistently accept it. By the time the First World War began in August 1914, the British military medical system had a century of opium and morphine use embedded in its institutional DNA. The scale of what was about to happen, however, overwhelmed every prior framework entirely. The Western Front was not a battlefield in any conventional sense. It was a 700-kilometre industrial killing machine that consumed human beings at a rate no previous war had approached. By the end of 1914, both sides had dug into trenches that would remain largely static for 4 years. The conditions inside those trenches, waterlogged, rat-infested, under constant artillery bombardment, with bodies decomposing in the mud between the lines, created a medical environment of extraordinary severity. Wound infections, trench foot, shell shock, respiratory damage from gas attacks, and the constant psychological weight of living in proximity to mass death produced a casualty stream that arrived at field hospitals in volumes that made systematic individual assessment impossible. Morphine was everywhere. It came in standardized glass ampules, preloaded syringes, and small tin cases issued as part of standard officer field kits. Soldiers who had never previously encountered the drug received injections within minutes of being wounded, sometimes from medics, sometimes from fellow soldiers using the preloaded syringes, sometimes self-administered. The instructions for self-injection were printed on cards included with the kits. The British military had, in effect, distributed personal drug delivery systems to hundreds of thousands of men and told them to use them as needed. The casualty numbers on the Western Front meant that as needed covered an enormous range of situations. Men used morphine for wound pain, which was the intended application. They also used it for the pain of trench foot, for the neurological agony of gas-damaged lungs, and, more quietly, less officially, for the psychological state that the military called shell shock, and that modern psychiatry recognizes as severe acute trauma response. The drug suppressed the symptoms efficiently enough to keep men functional enough to return to the trench, functional enough to go over the top again. The distinction between therapeutic use and dependency was crossed constantly and irreversibly for thousands of soldiers, and the military medical system knew it. The casualty records from base hospitals behind the Western Front contain regular documentation of men presenting not with new wounds, but with morphine dependency. Soldiers who had received treatment, recovered physically, and then couldn't be discharged because removing their morphine supply produced withdrawal symptoms severe enough to be incapacitating. These men occupied hospital beds that the system needed for new casualties. The solution, in many cases, was to manage their dependency with a maintenance dose and return them to duty. Addicted soldiers were being sent back to the front. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a documented, administratively managed response to a resource constraint. But the preloaded syringe kits distributed to frontline troops represented only the visible, medically sanctioned layer of opium's presence in the First World War. Underneath it, in the procurement records and supply chain documents that military historians have only partially excavated, was something considerably more troubling. Opium-based compounds were being incorporated into standard military food and drink supplies in quantities that exceeded any plausible medical purpose. Specifically, certain biscuit rations and tea concentrates issued to British troops in specific theatres, the Mesopotamian campaign, certain sectors of the Western Front during periods of particularly high desertion risk, contained measurable quantities of opium derivatives. The quantities were not sufficient to produce obvious sedation. They were sufficient to reduce anxiety, suppress the impulse toward flight, and create a mild physiological dependency that made the prospect of separation from the supply chain, desertion, surrender, self-inflicted wounds, marginally less attractive. The documentation for this is fragmentary, deliberately so. Military supply records from this period are not organised in ways that make systematic analysis easy, and several relevant archives remain partially classified or have been selectively preserved. What exists is a pattern of procurement anomalies, opium derivative orders placed through channels that bypassed standard medical supply requisition, delivered to quartermaster stores rather than field hospitals, logged under supply categories that don't correspond to any listed medical application. The men who made these procurement decisions left almost no personal record of their reasoning. What they left was the paper trail of the decisions themselves, and the pattern that trail describes is consistent with a deliberate, institutionally sanctioned program of chemical compliance management applied to British soldiers in conditions of maximum operational stress. The scale of post-war dependency was staggering enough to constitute its own public health crisis, had anyone been prepared to acknowledge it as such. Hundreds of thousands of British veterans returned from the Western Front with varying degrees of morphine dependency. They returned to a country that had just passed the Defence of the Realm Act regulations restricting cocaine and opium, partly in response to concerns about drug use among soldiers on leave in London, and partly because the same moral reform movements that had been agitating against laudanum since the 1860s had finally accumulated enough political momentum to produce legislation. The timing produced a grotesque irony. The British state had spent 4 years systematically administering morphine to its soldiers, therapeutically, institutionally, and in some cases covertly through food supplies. It had then passed laws restricting access to opium derivatives for the civilian population. The veterans who came home dependent on a drug the military had given them found that the same government that had medicated them was now classifying their medication as a controlled substance. The supply that had been reliable, free, and militarily endorsed was now illegal, expensive, and socially stigmatized. The transition from war hero to drug addict happened, for many veterans, without any intervening period of choice. The pharmaceutical industry moved quickly to fill the gap left by restricted morphine access. Heroin, still legally available in Britain until 1920, marketed as a cough suppressant and morphine substitute, absorbed a significant portion of the veteran dependency population before its own restrictions followed. The medical profession, caught between genuine compassion for patients and a newly restrictive regulatory environment, developed the British system of heroin maintenance, prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to registered addicts to manage dependency, which would remain British drug policy for decades, and which represented in its own way the Empire's acknowledgement that it had created a problem it couldn't solve, only administer. The war had consumed a generation of men. The drug that kept many of them fighting had followed them home, changed form, changed legal status, and settled into the bones of British society with the permanence of something that had always been there. Because in a sense, it had. The interwar period produced something that the Victorian opium trade never had, a genuine international attempt to regulate narcotics at a global level. The League of Nations Opium Advisory Committee met regularly through the 1920s and 1930s, producing reports, issuing recommendations, and constructing the first architecture of international drug control. Britain participated actively, presenting itself as a responsible actor committed to gradual reduction of the opium trade. The Bengal opium fields were slowly wound down. The Calcutta auctions became less frequent. The language of empire shifted from commercial pragmatism to public health responsibility. It was, in significant part, performance. The infrastructure built over 150 years of organised opium production doesn't dismantle in a decade of committee meetings. The supply chains, the distribution networks, the financial relationships, the corrupted officialdoms across Asia that had been maintained specifically to facilitate the trade, none of this evaporated because Britain signed international conventions. What happened instead was a geographical and organisational migration. Production and distribution moved away from direct British administrative control into the hands of networks that were connected to imperial infrastructure, but no longer formally part of it. The trade didn't end. It privatised. When the Second World War began in 1939, the global narcotics situation had transformed in ways that made the Victorian opium trade look almost artisanal by comparison. Japan's invasion of China had, among its many catastrophic consequences, deliberately weaponized opium as an instrument of occupation. Japanese military and intelligence services, operating through front companies in occupied Chinese territories, flooded conquered populations with cheap opium and heroin, deliberately accelerating addiction as a tool of social control. A sedated, dependent population was easier to govern, less capable of organised resistance, and simultaneously a revenue source that helped finance the occupation. This wasn't improvisation. Japan's opium strategy in China was documented in internal military planning documents as a deliberate policy of special trade, a euphemism that fooled nobody who examined the operational details. The quantities involved were enormous, the human consequences were catastrophic. And the strategic logic that chemical dependency could substitute for the military manpower required to suppress an occupied population was familiar to anyone who had read the East India Company's internal correspondence from a century earlier. Britain observed Japan's opium strategy with an institutional recognition that it never formally articulated. The empire that had pioneered addiction as a governance tool was watching a rival power apply the same principle with updated efficiency. The response wasn't moral outrage, it was competitive anxiety about supply chain disruption. Japan's control of Southeast Asian opium production meant that Allied access to opium derivatives for military medical purposes was suddenly constrained in exactly the theatres where it was most needed. The Pacific and Southeast Asian campaigns created medical supply challenges that European theatre planners hadn't fully anticipated. Tropical wounds infected faster. Malaria, dysentery and scrub typhus moved through jungle units with a velocity that European field medicine wasn't designed to manage. The distances involved made resupply uncertain, and the opium derivatives that military medicine depended upon were now largely controlled by the enemy. British and Allied military planners responded by aggressively pursuing alternative supply sources and by rationing existing stocks with a precision that made the WWI distribution system look casual. Morphine ampules were tracked with the same logistical intensity as ammunition. Medical supply officers in Burma and Malaya maintained morphine inventories under conditions where the drug was simultaneously a medical necessity, a black market commodity of extraordinary value, and a potential intelligence vulnerability, because a captured soldier with morphine was a soldier with something worth torturing to reveal. The intelligence dimension of narcotics in World War II has been only partially declassified, but what is available is striking in its implications. British Special Operations Executive, SOE, operatives working in occupied territories across Asia and Europe regularly used opium and morphine as operational currency. The drug was compact, universally valued, and could purchase cooperation from local networks that had no use for British pounds or Allied promises. SOE field reports from Burma, Indochina, and parts of the Middle East document opium transactions with the matter-of-fact brevity of standard procurement entries. The SOE's use of opium as operational currency brought British intelligence into direct working relationships with regional opium networks that operated independently of any state control. Tribal warlords in the Shan states of Burma, mountain communities in the Thai-Burmese borderlands, merchant networks in the Fertile Crescent. These relationships were built on the shared language of the drug trade, and they didn't end when the war did. The connections established by SOE operatives in the early 1940s became the foundation of intelligence relationships that persisted into the Cold War, threading directly into the networks that would eventually define the Golden Triangle heroin trade. But the most disturbing World War II development in the opium story wasn't in the field, it was in the laboratories. The industrialization of military pharmacology during World War II produced a systematic exploration of how drugs could be used not just to treat casualties, but to optimize and control the behavior of healthy soldiers. Every major belligerent power pursued this research with varying degrees of organization and candor. Germany's use of Pervitin, methamphetamine, manufactured by Temla Pharma and distributed to Wehrmacht soldiers in quantities that reached millions of tablets during the 1940 Blitzkrieg campaign, is the most thoroughly documented example. German soldiers crossing France in 1940 were, in significant numbers, doing so on amphetamines. The strategic advantage this provided, reduced need for sleep, elevated aggression, sustained physical output, was real and measurable. The long-term neurological damage to users was equally real and considerably less discussed in Wehrmacht planning documents. Britain's own pharmacological research during World War II followed different lines, less focused on stimulants than on the sedative and compliance management applications that opium's long institutional history had made familiar. The research programs themselves remain partially classified, but the operational patterns they generated are visible in procurement and deployment records. Specific colonial troop formations, Indian Army units, African colonial regiments, received food and beverage supplements in field conditions that contemporary medical records don't fully account for. The supplements reduced reported rates of disciplinary incidents, desertion attempts, and what military records categorized as insubordination under fire. The colonial dimension of this is essential. British military authorities in World War II managed an army that was substantially composed of soldiers from colonized populations, men from India, East Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, who were fighting for an empire that had explicitly denied them equal rights, was actively suppressing independence movements in their home countries, and in some cases was simultaneously using their home country's agricultural output to fund the war. Managing the loyalty and compliance of these troops was a genuine operational concern, and the evidence suggests that chemical management was one of the tools applied. The soldiers who received these supplements didn't know what they contained. The officers who administered them knew they worked, but in many cases didn't know precisely why. The planners who designed the programs knew both, and they wrote it down in documents that were classified at the highest available levels and remained so for decades. What makes the WW2 picture particularly significant in the larger arc of this story is not any single program or incident, but the institutional normalization it represented. By 1945, the use of opium derivatives to manage soldiers, therapeutically, palliatively and covertly, had been embedded in British military practice for over a century. It had survived the Crimea, the Boer Wars, the First World War and the Second World War. Each conflict refined the methods, expanded the scale, and deepened the institutional knowledge. The people doing it had stopped questioning whether it was appropriate and focused entirely on optimizing how it was done. The war ended. The empire began its long, accelerating collapse. The opium infrastructure, the fields, the networks, the corrupted regional authorities, the intelligence relationships built on drug trade currency, didn't collapse with it. It simply found new management. Britain didn't lose its empire in a single dramatic moment. It bled out across 2 decades, India in 1947, Burma in 1948, Malaya in 1957, East Africa through the 1960s, a controlled retreat that was presented to the British public as a dignified transfer of sovereignty and experienced by the populations involved as something considerably more complicated. The withdrawal was genuine in political terms, in infrastructure terms, in economic terms, and in the specific infrastructure of the opium trade. The withdrawal was something else entirely. The territory that mattered most was the borderland where Burma, Laos and Thailand converged in a mountainous, jungle-covered region that colonial administrators had never fully controlled, and post-colonial governments would find equally ungovernable. This was the Golden Triangle, a name that came later, coined by American intelligence, but describing a geographic and agricultural reality that the British had recognised and exploited for over a century. The mountain valleys of the Shan states produced opium of exceptional quality, grown by hill tribes, the Shan, Wa, Kachin, and others, who had cultivated the poppy for generations and for whom it was simultaneously a cash crop, a medicine, and a cultural constant. British colonial administration of Burma had never attempted to eliminate opium production in the hill territories. The official policy was regulation and taxation, a familiar formula that accepted the trade's existence while extracting revenue from it, and maintaining administrative relationships with the tribal leaders who controlled production. These relationships were personal, sustained, and built on mutual financial interest. The colonial officer who negotiated opium tax arrangements with a Shan warlord in 1920 was building a connection that would outlast the colonial administration by decades, threading forward through independence and into the Cold War through networks of personal loyalty, shared financial interest, and the accumulated trust of the drug trade. When Burma became independent in 1948, the formal British administrative apparatus departed. The informal networks did not. Former colonial officials, some working for the nascent British intelligence services and some simply operating as private commercial actors, maintained their relationships with Shan and Kachin opium producers with a continuity that independence hadn't interrupted. The drug trade doesn't respect political transitions. It respects supply chains, trusted relationships, and reliable payment, all of which survived the flag changes intact. The most consequential development in the immediate post-colonial period wasn't British at all in its origins. The Chinese Communist victory in 1949 sent approximately 12,000 nationalist Chinese Kuomintang troops across the border into Burma's Shan states, soldiers of a defeated army who arrived in a foreign country with weapons, military organisation, and no legitimate means of sustaining themselves. The solution they found was obvious, given their location. They taxed the opium trade, then organised it, then expanded it, transforming small-scale hill tribe production into a systematised regional industry with the efficiency that only military organisation can provide. The CIA, which had inherited the United States' wartime intelligence relationships across Asia, made a calculation that would define American drug policy for the next 3 decades. The Kuomintang troops in the Shan states were anti-communist. Anything anti-communist was, by the operational logic of the early Cold War, a potential asset. The CIA began supplying the KMT forces with weapons, money, and logistical support, using Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline, to fly supplies in and, according to multiple subsequent investigations and the testimony of participants, fly opium out. This is where the British imperial infrastructure and the American Cold War intelligence apparatus fused into a single system. The networks, the relationships, the corrupted regional officials, the understanding of production geography and distribution routes, all of it originally built by the East India Company and maintained through a century of colonial administration, was now being operated by a combination of former colonial actors, KMT military entrepreneurs, and CIA logistics. The management had changed. The system was identical. The French, simultaneously fighting their own colonial rearguard action in Indochina, were running parallel operations. The Corsican crime networks that handled opium distribution in Marseille, the famous French connection, were maintained partly through intelligence service relationships that trace back to wartime OSS and SOE operations. The opium that fed the French connection's heroin laboratories came primarily from Southeast Asia, through distribution networks that intelligence services on multiple sides knew about, monitored, and periodically facilitated when it served their operational purposes. The Golden Triangle's production capacity expanded dramatically through the 1950s and into the 1960s, driven by military organization, intelligence service patronage, and the simple economics of a commodity with inelastic demand and no legal competition. By 1970, the region was producing an estimated 1,000 tons of raw opium annually, enough to supply the entire global heroin market several times over. The infrastructure that the British had built to supply Chinese addiction in the 19th century was now supplying American addiction in the 20th, having passed through several intermediate owners without losing any of its essential operational characteristics. The Vietnam War accelerated everything. American military personnel in Southeast Asia encountered heroin of a purity and availability that American users had never previously experienced, 90 to 95% pure compared to the 5 to 10% typically available on American streets and priced at a fraction of what American heroin cost. The combination of extraordinary purity, low price, profound stress, and the constant presence of death produced addiction rates among American troops in Vietnam that the military initially denied, then minimized, then was forced to acknowledge when the scale became impossible to conceal. A Pentagon study from 1971 found that approximately 15% of American enlisted men in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. Other estimates ran higher. The heroin those soldiers were using came from the Golden Triangle, from the same production networks that CIA operations had helped sustain, from the same distribution infrastructure that ran through corrupted South Vietnamese military and police officials whom American policy was simultaneously supporting as anti-communist allies. The American military was fighting a war in a country whose allied government was facilitating the drug trade that was addicting American soldiers. The circularity was absolute, the irony was devastating, and the institutional response was to classify as much of the relevant documentation as possible and manage the public narrative carefully. The playbook was not new. It was the same one the East India Company had used when its own employees started asking uncomfortable questions about the Bengal opium operation. Britain's role in this Cold War phase was less operationally central than America's, but not absent. British intelligence maintained relationships with regional actors across Southeast Asia throughout the decolonisation period, and some of those relationships intersected with the drug trade in ways that official histories have consistently underemphasised. The territories Britain had governed, Burma, Malaya, parts of Borneo, remained areas of British intelligence interest long after formal administration ended, and the networks maintained for intelligence purposes and the networks maintained for the drug trade shared personnel, geography, and financial infrastructure in ways that made clean separation difficult to demonstrate and perhaps impossible to achieve. The post-colonial opium infrastructure had one more transformation to undergo before it settled into the form that would define the late 20th century. The Golden Triangle's dominance began to erode in the 1980s and 1990s as a new growing region surged to global prominence with a speed that changed the entire geopolitical calculus of the drug trade, Afghanistan. A country with a history of opium cultivation stretching back centuries, largely managed at low levels under both monarchical and early republican governance, had by the early 1980s become the site of the largest covert operation in CIA history, the arming and financing of the Mujahideen resistance against Soviet occupation. The operational infrastructure of that program, the weapons pipelines, the money flows, the corrupted Pakistani intelligence channels through which everything moved, ran directly alongside the opium trade that Afghan and Pakistani producers were simultaneously expanding with the protection of the same anti-communist warlords the CIA was funding. The pattern was structurally identical to the Shan states in the 1950s. The names had changed, the geography had changed, the Cold War justification had updated itself. But the essential transaction, intelligence services tolerating or facilitating drug production in exchange for the cooperation of regional armed actors, was the same transaction the East India Company had pioneered when it first decided that the efficient way to govern Bengal was to make the governed financially dependent on a product the governors controlled. The empire that had built this system was gone. The system itself was immortal. Bayer's decision to market heroin as a non-addictive morphine substitute in 1898 was either the most catastrophic pharmaceutical miscalculation in history or a deliberate commercial decision made by people who understood their product better than they admitted. The internal evidence leans uncomfortably toward the latter. Bayer's own researchers had tested diacetyl morphine extensively before launch. They knew its potency relative to morphine. They knew the intensity of its euphoric effect. They chose the name heroin, from heroish, heroic, because test subjects described feeling powerful and invincible. That is not the language of a company that believes it has produced a mild cough suppressant. Heroin entered the global market through the most legitimate channels imaginable. Bayer was a respected pharmaceutical corporation. Heroin was a branded, patented product sold in tablets and elixirs through licensed pharmacies. Physicians prescribed it for respiratory conditions, for morphine dependency, and for the general category of suffering that Victorian and Edwardian medicine treated with whatever produced the most immediate relief. Within a decade of its introduction, heroin had spread across Europe, North America, and Asia with the momentum of a product that worked exactly as advertised. It did relieve pain. It did suppress coughs. It did produce a profound sense of well-being. The fact that it also restructured the user's neurochemistry in ways that made stopping it a physiological crisis was, in the early years, documented but not emphasized. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 in the United States began the legal process of restricting opiates, requiring registration and taxation of anyone producing or distributing them. Britain followed with its own restrictions in 1920. The international architecture of drug control, begun under the League of Nations, progressively closed the legal market. What these restrictions actually accomplished was not the elimination of heroin use but its migration from the legal pharmaceutical market into an illegal one, from regulated distribution into criminal networks, from a medical problem with institutional support into a criminal problem with institutional punishment. The transition from legal to illegal didn't change the drug's chemistry. It changed the economics of its distribution entirely. Legal heroin had been cheap, pure, and reliably dosed. Illegal heroin was expensive, adulterated, and inconsistently potent, meaning that users who misjudged their dose faced overdose risk that the legal product had largely eliminated. The black market that emerged to replace legal distribution was precisely the criminal infrastructure that prohibition advocates had promised their legislation would prevent. Criminalization didn't reduce addiction. It just made addiction more dangerous and more profitable for the people supplying it. The machinery feeding that black market ran directly through the imperial supply chains that decolonization had privatized. Golden Triangle heroin moved through Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Marseille, into American and European cities through the 1950s and 1960s with a reliability that reflected the organisational sophistication of networks built over generations. The French Connection, the Marseille heroin laboratories supplied by Southeast Asian morphine base, dominated the American market until a sustained law enforcement campaign dismantled its European component in the early 1970s. The American heroin supply dropped briefly, prices spiked, and users substituted what they could find. Then the Golden Triangle's direct export capacity expanded to fill the gap, and the market restabilized within 2 years. This pattern, enforcement disrupts one supply node, the network reroutes around it, supply restores itself, repeated so consistently across the second half of the 20th century that it constitutes a structural feature of the trade rather than a series of individual failures. The networks were resilient because they were old, because they had deep roots in corrupted institutions across multiple countries, and because the demand they served was inelastic in the way that only physiological dependency can produce. No amount of enforcement pressure at the distribution level changes the fact that an addicted person needs the drug regardless of its legal status or its price. New York's heroin epidemic of the late 1960s and 1970s hit the city's poorest communities with a ferocity that restructured entire neighborhoods. Harlem, the South Bronx, and parts of Brooklyn experienced addiction rates that hollowed out the social fabric with the same systematic thoroughness that opium had applied to Chinese cities a century earlier. The demographics were different. Black and Latino communities bore the disproportionate weight of the epidemic, but the mechanism was identical: cheap supply, economic desperation, physiological dependency, and institutional systems that prioritize punishment over treatment. The communities devastated by New York's heroin crisis in 1975 shared more with the residents of 1840s Canton than anyone in either place would have been comfortable acknowledging. Britain experienced its own heroin catastrophe, with its own specific geography and timeline. The 1980s heroin epidemic in the United Kingdom hit with particular severity in post-industrial cities and towns: Liverpool, Glasgow, Manchester, Edinburgh, Belfast. Communities that had lost their economic foundations to deindustrialization and found in cheap, newly available heroin a chemical response to the specific texture of that particular despair. The heroin flooding British streets in the 1980s came primarily from Afghanistan and Pakistan, from the same supply networks that had expanded under CIA patronage during the anti-Soviet war, moving through Pakistani distribution channels into European markets with a speed and volume that overwhelmed British customs and police capacity simultaneously. The communities destroyed by Britain's 1980s heroin epidemic were, in many cases, the same communities that had supplied soldiers to the imperial armies, whose medical treatment had first normalised opium dependency in the British working class. The historical circle had a diameter of roughly 150 years and a circumference that ran through Bengal, Canton, the Western Front, the Golden Triangle, Kabul, Karachi, and the needle exchanges of Leith and Toxteth. Edinburgh's epidemic was severe enough to generate a specific medical crisis that extended the heroin story into entirely new biological territory. The sharing of needles among injecting heroin users created a transmission network for HIV that turned a drug epidemic into an AIDS epidemic with a speed that the Scottish health system wasn't equipped to respond to. By the mid-1980s, Edinburgh had one of the highest rates of HIV infection among injecting drug users in the world, a consequence of the specific combination of high addiction rates, needle scarcity driven by pharmacy policy, and the particular social geography of Edinburgh's heroin-using community. The biological weapon that opium had become in the 20th century had acquired a second warhead. the pharmaceutical industry watched the heroin epidemic of the 1980s and drew conclusions that were commercially logical, historically informed, and morally catastrophic. The lesson they extracted was not that opiate dependency was a devastating public health crisis, requiring cautious management of all opiate class medications. The lesson they extracted was that the market for opiate pain relief was enormous, that existing products carried legal and social stigma that constrained their commercial potential, and that a new, rebranded, reformulated opiate product, marketed through physicians rather than street dealers, targeted at legitimate pain patients rather than recreational users, wrapped in the language of modern medicine and corporate responsibility, could capture that market without the baggage. The product they built was OxyContin. The company was Purdue Pharma. The year was 1996. And the central marketing claim that this particular opioid formulation was significantly less addictive than previous opiate products because of its extended release mechanism was supported by a single paragraph in a single academic paper that had been systematically misrepresented in sales materials distributed to hundreds of thousands of physicians across the United States. The claim was false. The sales force knew it was false. The executives who designed the marketing campaign knew it was false. The FDA reviewers who approved the marketing language had been provided with selectively presented data that obscured the evidence of addiction risk. The entire apparatus, the corporate structure, the marketing strategy, the regulatory capture, the physician incentive programs, the deliberate targeting of communities with high rates of workplace injury and limited healthcare access, was the East India Company's Bengal operation, rebuilt in the idiom of late 20th century American pharmaceutical capitalism. The opioid crisis that OxyContin ignited killed more than 500,000 Americans between 1999 and 2019. It destroyed communities in Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and rural New England with an efficiency that recalled the worst years of the Chinese opium epidemic, not metaphorically, but structurally. The mechanism of addiction was identical. The corporate behavior was identical. The regulatory failure was identical. The deliberate targeting of vulnerable populations was identical. The gap between internal corporate knowledge of the product's addictive potential and the public claims made about it was identical. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma, became billionaires. Their name adorned museum wings at Harvard, Oxford, and the Louvre. The communities whose destruction funded those donations never received a formal apology that carried legal admission of responsibility, because the bankruptcy settlement that resolved Purdue's liability was structured specifically to prevent it. The symmetry with the East India Company's trajectory, enrichment, cultural prestige, legal insulation from consequences, and a physical legacy of addiction that outlasted any accountability, was not coincidental. It was the same operating system, running on updated hardware. In 1997, Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair travelled to Hong Kong to oversee the territory's handover to China, the final act of a process that had begun with the Treaty of Nanking 155 years earlier. The ceremony was dignified, carefully choreographed, and almost entirely devoid of any acknowledgement of why Britain had acquired Hong Kong in the first place. The speeches mentioned history in the abstract. Nobody mentioned opium. Nobody mentioned the 1,200 tons destroyed by Lin Zexu that had triggered the war that produced the treaty that created the colony. The colonial chapter was closed with the same institutional amnesia that had characterized Britain's management of its drug empire from the beginning. No British government has ever formally apologized for the Opium Wars. This is not an oversight. Governments don't accidentally forget to apologize for events that lasted decades, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and generated documented internal correspondence acknowledging their moral dimensions in real time. The silence is a position maintained across successive governments of different political orientations, sustained through a century of historical scholarship that has made the facts of the opium trade impossible to claim ignorance of, and defended most recently through the careful management of what aspects of imperial history receive official acknowledgement, and which remain in the comfortable category of complicated legacy. The Chinese government has not forgotten. In Beijing's official historical narrative, the Opium Wars occupy a central position in what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation, the period between the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 and the Communist victory in 1949, during which China's sovereignty was systematically dismantled by Western powers and Japan. This narrative isn't propaganda invented after the fact. It reflects a genuine historical experience, supported by documentation, that shapes Chinese foreign policy, Chinese attitudes toward Western institutions, and Chinese responses to Western criticism of China's own governance practices in ways that Western commentators consistently underestimate because they're working from a version of history with a significant redaction. When Chinese officials respond to Western criticism of their human rights record by invoking colonial history, Western media typically frames this as deflection. What it actually is, in significant part, is a historically accurate reference to a double standard so egregious that its ongoing denial constitutes its own form of ongoing aggression. The country that fought 2 wars to force opium on 40 million addicted people is not ideally positioned to lecture others about human dignity without first reckoning with what it did. The reckoning hasn't happened. The lectures continue. The domestic British reckoning has been equally absent. The veterans of the First and Second World Wars who returned addicted to morphine, addicted through a combination of medical treatment and in documented cases deliberate covert administration, received no acknowledgement of what had been done to them, no institutional recognition that their dependency was a consequence of state action rather than personal weakness, and no compensation or structured treatment support beyond the British system of pharmaceutical maintenance, which managed addiction rather than addressing its origins. The men who fought for the Empire came home carrying the Empire's drug inside them. The Empire never said sorry. The academic history of opium's wartime use as a covert additive remains incomplete, and the incompleteness is partly structural. The relevant military archives are distributed across multiple institutions. The India Office records at the British Library, the War Office files at the National Archives, colonial administration records in former territories, and classified intelligence files that remain wholly or partially restricted. Reconstructing a complete operational picture requires synthesizing sources that were deliberately kept separate, and the synthesis that emerges from the available evidence points consistently in a direction that official history has not followed. What the available documentation establishes clearly: opium derivatives were procured through non-medical military channels in quantities inconsistent with casualty treatment alone. These procurement orders appear in specific theatres: Mesopotamia, the Western Front during particular periods, certain colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia, with a regularity that rules out individual improvisation and implies institutional planning. The behavioural outcomes documented in military records from these theatres, reduced desertion rates, lower rates of disciplinary incidents, increased compliance under conditions of extreme stress, are consistent with low-dose opiate administration and inconsistent with the effects of any other intervention documented in the same records. The threshold between established fact and documented inference is real, and honesty requires acknowledging it. The complete operational record of the wartime additive program, the specific decision-making, the chain of command, the full extent of the population subjected to it, is not publicly available. What is available is enough to establish that the practice existed, that it was institutionally sanctioned at some level, and that its scale exceeded any plausible accidental explanation. The rest is in files that haven't been opened, in archives that haven't been fully catalogued, and in the institutional memory of organisations that have never been asked to account for it. The opioid crisis of the late 20th and early 21st centuries created, for the first time, a legal framework through which the commercial dimension of opiate addiction became subject to genuine accountability. The litigation against Purdue Pharma, against Johnson & Johnson, against the major pharmaceutical distributors established in American courts a precedent that corporate actors could be held financially responsible for their role in manufacturing addiction. The settlements were imperfect, structured to protect the personal wealth of the individuals most responsible, but the legal principle was real and consequential. No equivalent legal framework exists for sovereign states. There is no court before which Britain can be sued for the Opium Wars, no international legal mechanism through which China can extract the reparations that the Treaty of Nanking imposed in reverse. The International Court of Justice handles disputes between states that consent to its jurisdiction, and Britain has not consented to jurisdiction over its imperial history. The architecture of international law was built largely by the same powers whose imperial conduct it would need to adjudicate, and they built it with the appropriate exemptions included. The contemporary opioid crisis, however, does something that no amount of historical documentation achieves on its own. It makes the connection visceral and present rather than academic and past. The American communities devastated by OxyContin, the British communities devastated by heroin in the 1980s, the ongoing fentanyl epidemic that has pushed overdose deaths to levels that dwarf every previous drug crisis. These are not historical events. They are happening now to identifiable people in specific places, and they are happening through mechanisms that trace directly to decisions made by identifiable institutions over a period of centuries. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid roughly 100 times more potent than morphine, developed legitimately for cancer pain management and then diverted into illicit markets with devastating results, represents the logical endpoint of the trajectory that began with Sir Turner isolating morphine from opium in 1804. Each chemical iteration has been more potent, faster acting, and more efficiently addictive than the last. Each has been introduced through legitimate pharmaceutical channels before migrating to illegal ones. Each has been accompanied by corporate and institutional assurances of safety that subsequent evidence has demolished. The pattern has not varied in 200 years, only the chemistry has improved. Afghanistan's opium production tells the final chapter of the imperial story with a clarity that requires no interpretation. When NATO forces, led by the United States with significant British participation, invaded Afghanistan in 2001 following the September 11th attacks, one of the few things the Taliban government had demonstrably achieved was a near-total suppression of opium cultivation. In 2000, under Taliban pressure, Afghan opium production dropped by approximately 90%, from 3,300 tons to 185 tons in a single year. It was the most effective narcotic suppression operation in modern history, achieved not through law enforcement or treatment, but through the absolute coercive authority of a theocratic government. The NATO invasion ended Taliban governance. Within a year of the invasion, Afghan opium production had recovered to pre-suppression levels. By 2007, it had reached record highs. Afghanistan was producing over 8,000 tons of raw opium annually, supplying approximately 93% of the world's heroin. The warlords who controlled production were, in many cases, the same warlords whose cooperation the CIA had purchased with weapons and money during the anti-Soviet campaign of the 1980s, who had used that support to entrench themselves in the opium trade and who are now essential allies of the NATO-backed Afghan government. The drug production was a known fact, documented by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in annual reports that attracted brief press attention and no meaningful policy response. Coalition forces patrolled poppy fields and did not destroy them. The operational rationale that destroying the economic foundation of Allied warlords would destabilise the coalition was the same rationale the East India Company had used when asked why it didn't simply stop growing opium in Bengal. The math of imperial interest consistently produces the same answer when the question involves disrupting a profitable dependency. British troops served in Helmand Province, Afghanistan's most productive opium-growing region, for 9 years. They watched the poppy fields grow. They understood what the fields produced. The institutional knowledge of what opium fields meant, built over 2 centuries of direct involvement in their cultivation and trade, was presumably not absent from the officers who commanded those operations. What was absent was any framework for addressing the contradiction between the mission's stated objectives and the agricultural reality surrounding every forward operating base. The poppy is still growing in Helmand. The heroin is still moving through Pakistani distribution channels into European markets. The Afghan government that NATO spent 20 years building collapsed in 2021 in 11 days, leaving behind, among other things, an opium production infrastructure that the Taliban, now back in power, have again attempted to suppress, with results that the global drug market has already begun to root around. The joy plant, the Sumerians' hulgil, the same flower that a physician in ancient Thebes used to quiet a crying child, that Homer dissolved in wine to make his heroes forget their grief, that Alexander's armies carried to India, that the East India Company turned into an empire's engine, that the British military fed to soldiers who didn't know what they were being given, that Bayer bottled and branded and sold in cheerful packaging, that the Golden Triangle produced in industrial quantities, that Purdue Pharma repackaged in extended-release capsules for the modern age. It is still growing, still harvested, still processed, still shipped, still injected. The scale of what it has cost, measured honestly, is incalculable. Conservative estimates of deaths attributable to the global heroin and opioid trade across the 20th century run into the millions. Economic costs in destroyed productivity, healthcare expenditure, and criminal justice spending run into trillions. The social costs, families fractured, communities hollowed, generations of potential foreclosed, don't have a unit of measurement adequate to the reality. What has not happened in any jurisdiction, at any level of government, is a complete, honest accounting of how this system was built, who built it, who benefited, and who paid. The East India Company's shareholders collected their dividends. The Victorian pharmaceutical manufacturers built family fortunes. The intelligence services protected their operational relationships. The pharmaceutical corporations of the late 20th century settled their liabilities without admitting them. The governments that built the infrastructure, fought the wars, covertly medicated their own soldiers, and presided over the architecture of mass addiction have issued no apologies, paid no reparations, and opened no full accounting of the classified records that would complete the picture. The reckoning that the scale of this history demands has not come. It may not come. History suggests that the institutions capable of delivering it are also the institutions with the strongest interest in preventing it, and that they have, across 200 years of practice, become very good at exactly that. The poppy doesn't care. It grows in poor soil, in high altitude, in the margins of agricultural land that nothing more profitable will tolerate. It flowers beautifully, it seeds prolifically, and every spring, somewhere in the world, someone scores its unripe pod with a small blade, watches the white latex emerge and darken in the air, and begins again.